Hey guys, we're going to wrap up the court system packet today. Super quick review. Remember, at the federal level, there's 3 levels of courts. At the state level, there's 4 levels of courts. The first level is your trial court. That's where the original jurisdiction is, the place where it starts. And then remember, if you are going to appeal your case, you would go up in the triangle. And also remember, you can't just appeal your case because you're unhappy with the verdict. There has to be some kind of mistake, whether that be there was evidence that was brought in, or maybe a right was violated of yours, or something like that. And any of those courts would be your appellate court. So you have your trial courts where the trial happens. You have your appellate court, any court above that you end up going to. So when we get into like these landmark court cases in a few days, all of those were appellate court decisions. So get to your packet where it says a federal trial court, federal appellate court, number 2. So on this, let's start off with the lowest federal court, the U.S. District Court. All right, look at that speech bubble to the left. It says the U.S. District Court determines the facts of the case and will decide if someone is innocent or guilty. So make sure you fill that in. And then there are 96, that top right bubble, there's 96 U.S. District Courts spread out around the country. Our closest one is in Tampa. And then the bottom right speech bubble, the U.S. District Court is the only federal court that does 3 things. They determine the facts of the case, they will decide verdicts, and they will allow witnesses. Why is that the only federal court? Because that is literally the only trial court. Every other court at the federal level is all appellates. And remember, with appellate courts, you don't listen to the evidence, you don't determine whether you're guilty or not. They're just simply looking for a mistake. Okay? So now go down to the middle triangle, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. There's 3 other like AKAs, potato kind of things that can be used for this court. The first one is the Federal Courts of Appeals. Second one is just simply Court of Appeal, or third one is Appellate Court. They all mean the same thing. It means it's not the trial court. That means that's where the appeal is happening. Look at the bottom left box for that one. What do circuit courts decide? They try to decide if there was a mistake at the trial court, at the U.S. District Court. Okay? Don't worry about what is appellate jurisdiction. We've already talked about that. Well, actually, go ahead and fill that in. Remember, appellate jurisdiction is they're not listening to the case for the first time. They're just trying to determine a mistake. And there are, how many U.S. Circuit Courts are there? There are 12 of these U.S. Circuit Courts around the United States. So obviously not one per state. Okay. So then we go up to our top court in the nation, the U.S. Supreme Court. Once the U.S. Supreme Court has said something, what they say goes. So judicial review, go to that top box. What is judicial review? Judicial review, I think we've talked about that this year. Judicial review is simply when judges review something to determine if it's constitutional or not. So a lot of times when it gets to the Supreme Court level, the U.S. Supreme Court level, they're doing judicial review. They're trying to determine, all right, is this thing allowed? Like, should this law be allowed? Should this previous ruling have been allowed? They're looking at the constitutionality of it. All right. What can judicial review allow the Supreme Court to do? It can allow them to overturn a case or kick a case out and that kind of stuff if they determine it shouldn't have been allowed to begin with. Go to that bottom right box. What does the U.S. Supreme Court determine if they hear or how does the U.S. Supreme Court determine if they hear a particular case? So there's thousands and thousands of court cases that try to make it to the U.S. Supreme Court every year. They'll only hear about 70, 80 of those cases. So what's going to determine if they pick that court case over the other court cases that try to get there? Number one, is it of national importance? Is it a court case that could potentially impact a lot of people around the country? Number two, did the lower court invalidate a federal law? In other words, like, did the lower court mess up and make a federal law like invalid, like not correct anymore? And also the reason the Supreme Court might hear a case. So remember, there's 3 levels at the federal. Let's say the U.S. District Court ruled for this person. then the person that lost appealed it, and the U.S. Circuit Court ruled for the other person. Well, shoot, now both of the federal courts, one federal court says this person's right and one federal court says this person's right. So what the Supreme Court will do is say, okay, we got to determine which one is actually right. Okay, so they'll help with those kind of split decisions. Okay. Don't worry about that bottom left box, writ of certiorari. Don't worry about that one. Look at the top left box. It says when a case starts at the Supreme Court, it's called original jurisdiction. There is very, very, very rare times when you can actually jump all 2 levels below the U.S. Supreme Court and start at the U.S. Supreme Court. Rarely happens, but it can. So here's one. If it's a dispute between 2 or more states, it will go directly to the Supreme Court. And then if it involves like anything from outside of our country, like it involves like a diplomat from other countries, that will go directly to the U.S. Supreme Court as well. Okay, so make sure you have that page filled in. Now let's go to the back page, the state trial and state appellate courts. Notice that there's 4 levels at Florida: county court, circuit court, Florida District Court of Appeals, Florida Supreme Court. Now remember, so this guy says, I'm freaking out. State courts are confusing. Please help me know whether my trial court will be at the county court or at the circuit court. Because remember, if your trial court's at the county court, then the first appellate court for you would be the circuit court. But there is a time when you actually can skip the county court altogether and your trial starts at the circuit court. And if that's the case, your first appellate court is going to be the Florida District Court of Appeals. So look at this. It says your trial will be held at the county court if, number 1, if you're being charged with a misdemeanor, your trial's at the county court. And the other reason your trial would be at the county court is if you're being sued in a civil case, but the civil case is worth $15,000 or less. So misdemeanor or being sued $15,000 less, you're going to have your trial at the county court, which ours is in Bartow. Now, you would actually skip the trial court altogether. You can probably guess why, and go directly to the circuit court if, not a misdemeanor, but if you have a felony, and then if you're being sued for over $15,000, or if you're suing somebody for over $15,000. So let's say we are having a court case in Florida. Look down at Mr. Sleazeball down there. It says, hey, your lawyer, Mr. Sleazeball here. Yeah, we lost at the Florida Supreme Court, but don't worry. I can appeal our case to the U.S. Supreme Court if. So let's say we went through all 4 levels of the Florida court, and we lose at the the Florida court level. Remember, Florida Supreme Court is not the highest court. The U.S. Supreme Court is. But just because you lose at the Florida court doesn't mean you can go and whine up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Here's the only reason you can go from the Florida Supreme Court directly up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Ready? If you can prove that somehow, some way, the Florida Supreme Court violated your rights or violated the Constitution in some way or shape or form, that is the only way you can get yourself to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they're obviously going to have the final say. Okay? All right, so your entire packet should be filled in for the court systems now. 99.9% of you guys are doing amazing. For those few kids that have gotten into trouble this past week, let's tighten up, let's do good. And I'll be in there with you guys this Wednesday. See ya.